Welcome to Scoundrels, Scandals, Reprobates, Yankee Justice, a walk on the darker side of Newmarket. Before we start, I do want to say that this was never intended to be a program, and my interest in this was never intended to be walking tours or anything like this. But when I was researching for the strike in Newmarket when the mills went out, I kept coming across all of these little bits and pieces of Newmarket. So I kept photocopying them and throwing them in a notebook. Well, I now have like 2 notebooks. And John caught the craze, and I get these emails, I got another bit for you. This one's great. You got to use this one. So we're kind of like 2 little old ladies with tea and crumpets going back and forth. But the interesting thing is my background is in heritage tourism. And so I do a lot of training with communities that are looking to develop tourism programs for their communities. And one of the seminars that I do is cashing in on your local history. And it's interesting because you go into a community and they go, oh, nothing ever happened here. And I said, did you have a town newspaper? And they'll say, yes. I said, did you ever read it? And basically, that's where all of these come from, is from the town newspaper. But there's also things called family legends. So before I start tonight, I'm going to talk to you about a family legend that came to light in my family recently that John helped solve, and how the difference between a family legend and reality can sometimes be huge. At 10:30 one night, my messenger pinged, and it was my cousin Paul, and he said, did your grandmother ever talk to you about Uncle Joe? And I said, Uncle Joe? I didn't know we had an Uncle Joe. Oh yeah, we had Uncle Joe in 1930. He was on a horse and buggy coming down Elm Street. He was drunk, Auntie said he was drunk all the time. And he went over the bridge embankment and into the water, and they found him down below the dam, and he died. And I said, okay. I said, we'll have to check on that. And he said, well, it was Meme's sister. Well, Meme was my great-grandmother, and she was Amy Boucher. And I said, well, it would have been a Boucher because that would have been her brother. And so I started looking. And I looked all the way up till 1934. Nothing. I looked all the way back to 1925. Nothing. And I said, okay. So I know John's got all kinds of reports at his fingertips and stuff. So I said, can you help me out? I said, this is the story. This is what supposedly happened. So I get this email back that said, well, it's not quite how your great aunt recollected it. Number one, it was 1922. Number 2, he was in a car being driven by Fred Sanborn, who was the road agent for Newmarket. And 2 girls that were walking downtown saw the car come up over the hill, and they saw it careen into the embankment in front of the library and then shoot across the road through the fence and down into the water by the dam. And it was 2 days before they found the second body, but Fred Sanborn was in the car, and they dragged him up with the car. And it wasn't Joe Boucher, it was Phileas Boucher. So that shows you that Uncle Joe was Phileas, and there's a 10-year difference in time span, and it wasn't a horse and buggy, it was actually an automobile. But that's the difference between a family legend and reality. So, without further ado, this is your warning. It's your last chance. You can leave the room if you want. And let's see. Scoundrels, Reprobates, and Yankee Justice walk on the darker side of Newmarket. Special thanks to John, who keeps feeding me all of these things. First one we're going to talk about is the slaughterhouse. Many of you know where this is. Right now it's a parking lot on the corner of Elm Street and Nichols Ave. Okay, it was one of the first buildings that was torn down in the strike. After the strike for non-producing property, there were tons of buildings that were torn down. This was a 12-unit apartment building. It was huge. And it was called the slaughterhouse because of Hiram B. Jones and his wife, Ann. Now, Hiram was a little bit antsy, and he thought his wife, Ann, was stepping out on him while he was acting as first mate on one of the packet boats for the mills. So on June 4th, 1879, he came home, and in an argument ensued, he grabbed his straight-edge razor, reached around, and slit his wife's throat from ear to ear. Her scream was cut off. The neighbors broke down the door. They came in, blood all over him, blood all over the apartment. And from that point on, that was known as the slaughterhouse. And that unit was notoriously hard to rent. And the same with the building. Now, Mr. Jones, his lawyers tried repeatedly to get him off on temporary insanity. Well, they did interviews, and come to find out there was a Mr. French, who was the other man. There was Officer Bennett, who was called to the house in May for a domestic disturbance over Mr. French. And then there was a Mr. Stevens, who was actually his boss on the packet boat, that fired him the day that he slit his wife's throat because he was acting kind of strange. 5 trials, 5 appeals. He was still found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to be hanged. But his story wasn't over yet because he got pneumonia. And the state had to take him out of the prison and send him to the hospital and get him better so they could hang him for the murder. And don't you think that didn't start editorials across the state? So that's the story of the slaughterhouse. Next, we have the Durham murder. Actually, we talk about it in Newmarket because both people that did it were involved in Newmarket. It just happened to take place in Durham, out on Durham Point, on the property of the Mathis brothers, which we would know is the former Little Bay Buffalo Company. Peter Duvall was a young man about 27 years old. He was the oldest in a family of 5, including the mother and father. He was working in the mills, but due to his health and all of the lint and stuff in the mills, he was developing a lung disease. So he chose to go outside and to work outside and become a wood chopper. Well, he met this man called Henry Otis, also known as Henry Joy, also known as Henry Armstrong, also known as Henry Young. So you kind of get the picture what Henry was like. But he befriended Patrick. They became close friends. They completed all of the wood chopping job for the Mathis brothers, and Patrick's family had decided to move to Leominster, Mass, to work down there. And on the morning of the move, Patrick and Henry were to go out and settle up with the Mathis brothers. And they were at the Moody house where Henry was boarding when Mr. Moody said, "Why are you taking your axe? Because you're done." And Otis said, "Gee, I think I'll take it with me. I might want to cut something." Well, later that afternoon, he showed up. He had imbibed a lot of liquor. He was soaking wet, and Mrs. Moody said, "Henry, why are you so wet?" And he said, "Well, when I was crossing the river coming home, I fell through the ice and went in all the way." Well, all of a sudden, Peter was nowhere to be found. Henry had chopped his body into about 100 pieces and left him in the woods. The parents, of course, reported him missing. That's when the search started. Henry ended up stealing a horse from Mrs. Joy on Packers Falls Road and left town. But they did track down some things that pointed to him being the culprit. To the best of my knowledge, they have never found Mr. Otis. He probably came up with another one. The thought process is he also has the pay that Patrick Duvall was owed for the wood chopping job. And that was the Durham murder. Next, we have the fast walker. Now, fast walker was before the running craze, way before. And it was also before the bicycle craze. And basically what it was is people would show their athletic prowess by entering contests and walking. And you see in the old pictures, you know, the fast walkers, and it's kind of like a vaudevillian thing now, but back then it was considered entertainment. And we had a young man by the name of Lindell E. Hoyt, who was actually born in Newton, New Hampshire. And we don't know what time he came to the mills to work in the mills, but he was a fast walker and one of quite a bit of renown. And on Monday, March 11th in 1879, the 18-year-old had developed quite a pedestrian ability, and he had attempted the feat of walking 10 miles in 1 hour and 50 minutes, starting and ending at the town hall in the center of town. And he appeared dressed in a neat costume and struck into his gait that astonished the attending crowd. People used to gather to watch this. He finished the 10-mile streak in 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 33 seconds, so he got his record. Following Wednesday evening, he gave another exhibition of his powers with a 12-mile march. Mid-April, the 5-mile walking march attracted a small audience as the public was getting satiated with the class of entertainment known as fast walking. The end result was Ollie Keniston, first prize, $2. Time, 47:47. Lindell Hoyt, second prize, $1.50. Time, 48:48. Ed Stackpole, you'll notice some Newmarket names here. Third prize, $1. Time, about 50 minutes. The entertainment concluded with a social dance at the town hall in which only about 8 couples participated. The end of that craze came with the introduction of the safety bicycle. Before this time, bicycles had the big, huge front wheel and a little back wheel, and they were known as bone breakers or bone shakers. Well, the safety bicycle had 2 wheels of the same size, so that became much more exciting. But Lindell Hoyt was also a burglar, and not a very good one. December 8th in 1879, the Newmarket train depot was broken into, and a small amount of cash was stolen. From the circumstances and the evidence gathered, it indicated the primary suspect was Lindell Hoyt. He was also kind of a suspect in other burglaries committed in town over the past few weeks. He suddenly left Newmarket for his home in Candia, where his mom was living at the time, and a warrant was drawn up for his arrest. As Newmarket and Candia police arrived at the house, Lindell had seen them approaching, and growing into his fast-walking skills, he got away. Then, the following last week in December of 1879, J.L. Boardman's Boot and Shoe Store, which is the building you see. Whoops, I didn't want that. Come on the left. How do I turn it back on? It wasn't supposed to do that. It was supposed to be a laser pointer. We got it? Okay. Laser pointer. There you go. We call it the Tilton Hilton now. And that big building there, that's no longer there. That's the American Legion now. But it was foiled because they heard someone in the building and he left. Nathaniel Levitt, who was a buggy maker in town, and he lived on South Main Street, happened to be going through Lowell, Mass. a couple days later, and he saw Lindell Hoyt in Lowell, Mass. Got a police officer who arrested the burglar boy. Lindell denied the identity, continued to call himself a Mr. Brown. And Mr. Levitt ID'd him as Lindell Hoyt, and eventually he owned up to it. And he was brought to the Newmarket police station the last Monday in December and lodged in the town jail. On Tuesday morning, when the officer in charge went to get the prisoner his breakfast, he found the bird had flown the coop, breaking the bolt on the cell, leaving a wreck behind him. While incarcerated, he had made a partial confession, which also implicated several others. He was caught again. He was captured in Auburn, Maine, and taken to Portsmouth on Saturday. quite a crowd assembled here in Newmarket to wave at him as his train went through the station at Rockingham on the way to Exeter to the Supreme Court, where he pleaded guilty for breaking and entering the train depot at Newmarket, and he was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. He was also suspect of the murderous assault on a Mr. Jefferson Healy in Candia, but the evidence was not sufficient enough to warrant his arrest on that charge. He was 19 years old when he was convicted on April 19th in 1880 in Rockingham Superior Court to 5 years in the state prison. However, he died on October 30th, 1881, and his cause of death at 19 years old was nostalgia. It remains unknown where he's buried, what happened to his mother, or what the relationship was with Mr. Healy. But here we go, the millionaire and the factory girl. Supposedly with a fortune of between $50,000 and $500,000, you heard John mention him. He was our roller skating promoter, attorney Charles H. Smith. And in the same boarding house as him was a factory girl by the name of Mary Lambert. Well, it became noticeable that Mr. Smith and Mr. Lambert were spending a lot of time together. And all of a sudden, they disappeared. And truth be known, they traveled to Nice, France together, where they lived together, and Miss Lambert took care, supposedly, of Mr. Smith until he developed Bright's disease. Now, Bright's disease was a malfunction of the kidney at the time, so it was pretty much permanently going to be fatal. And he came back home to Boston, where he died in 1907. Well, fast forward, all of a sudden, Miss Lambert comes back to Dover and hires a lawyer and says, hey, I want the money that he promised me for taking care of him all of these years. And Mr. Smith's sister stepped forward and said, no, 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 I'm his sister. I deserve the money. Well, this was such a scandal. This is from 1906. Do you know how important news was in 1906 to have photos, engraving in the paper? This is the Boston Herald American, folks. We hit the big time. However, the sister's lawyer and Miss Lambert's lawyer fought and fought and fought and fought for years and years and years and years. And guess who got all the money? Yeah, neither the sister nor Miss Lambert got much of anything. So that is the factory girl and the millionaire. The next one is duck hunting. And by the way, this is by no means everything that happened in Newmarket. This is just a sampling. So, when your friend asks you in August if he can borrow your shotgun to practice duck hunting, which doesn't start till October, you might want to think about what he's asking. This is a real tongue twister. This is like she sits in her sleeping schlitz. This is Rose Kenniston versus Fred Kennerson. And even I get mixed up. So you'll have to try to follow. It seems that Mr. Fred Kennerson was a hired hand that was about 36 years old, and he was firmly enamored of a 15-year-old girl by the name of Rose Kenniston in Newmarket. And on the afternoon in August of 1907, Mr. Kennerson showed up at the house where Mrs. Kenniston was caring for an ill friend and wanted Rose to go riding with him. As Mr. Kenniston was drunk, Mrs. Kenniston said, no way are you taking my daughter anyway. So about mid-afternoon, Rose decided that she was going home, and she started off for home on Bay Road. Well, along about 5 p.m., Oliver Sanborn, farmer, was out raking in the fields when he heard moaning on the other side of the fence. Upon investigation, he found 2 people with gunshot wounds. It was a murder-suicide pact. Poor Miss Keniston was shot in the mouth, and it went up, and the shot lodged behind her right eyeball. And she was still alive. However, he didn't do a very good job when he put the muzzle in his mouth, because all he managed to do was blow off the lower half of his jaw. So, they were both laying there. Oliver Sanborn decides, I've got to get the sheriff and the doctor. So in his hay rake, he goes rumbling down Bay Road into town to find Sheriff Brackett and Dr. Toll, who follow him out. In the meantime, Mrs. Keniston, who was in one of the local shops, heard the news, and she fainted dead away and had to be revived. But she came to in time to ride the hay rake back out to the field with Oliver Sanborn. Once they got there, they decided that the wounds were mortal, and it would be too inhumane to move them, so they left them where they were. It was 2 hours for Mr. Keniston to die, and 4 hours for Miss Keniston to die. The county coroner did 4 inquests because everybody was up in arms that they felt that they did not do enough for them. And that was unrequited love. Next, how many people been to a Polish wedding? A lot of fun. I have a sister and a cousin that are results of a Polish wedding in the family. Well, Saturday, April 23rd, 1910, 10 young men from Dover attend a Polish wedding in Newmarket. While waiting for the train back to Dover, they are arrested downtown for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and insulting an officer. They were held in jail in the town hall till Monday, when Judge Alva Place fines each one $11.43, which was a lot of money back then. And then he states, and I quote, "Read it and weep. That will teach them not to be too gay in Newmarket." I told you, it's going to be weird. Nuisance. Now, if you know the owner of this building, you want to tease him, because I always tell him the building was known for a brothel. December 24th, 1881, 1 Exeter Street. Nice stone building. Michael Carrig was arrested for being drunk and beating his wife over the head with an axe. And both of them were arrested and held in jail. However, 2 years before, on December 26th, Patrick Behan, who was a roomer, was found dead in the back room of the house that was occupied by Michael Craig and his wife. This wasn't their first run-in with the law. After many, many investigations, nothing could be proved, so they could not do anything. When they went before the judge, he said, "As your wound is not serious, and you are both notoriously bad characters, a nuisance and a detriment to the community, you have 48 hours to leave town or be imprisoned." Newmarket Advertiser reports the mandate was obeyed, and it's to be hoped that they will not again infest this community. The tourist. Edward Eaton on New Road reported to the police department that a tourist had absconded with 2 of his chickens. Back then, in 1906, tourist was a euphemism for a hobo or a tramp. So upon investigation, the police officer going out New Road found the gentleman walking down the road with a chicken under each arm. So he apprehended the culprit and the chickens, put them in a vehicle, brought them back to the town hall jail cell, put the chickens in one cell, put the tourist in another, and went home for dinner. When he came back from dinner, he came back to the smell of chicken roasting. It seems that somehow the tourist had enticed the chickens over to the other cell, plucked them, wrung their necks, and was roasting them on the coal stove in his cell. Regardless of consuming the evidence, he was taken to Brentwood and given a term in the jail. Folsom Follies. The Folsom family is very well known in town. And in June of 1914, Henry H. Folsom, who was from Somerville, Mass., and his wife Mary used to summer here in Rockingham, which was not unusual at the time for old families. Now, Henry was also a member of the Boston Club of Newmarket, which I don't know if any of you know, but there used to be a Newmarket Club in Boston of expatriates that would meet at a hotel once a year. They would have big dinners. They would go on outings. They were also responsible for writing some of the earliest histories in Newmarket, getting them in the papers. Nellie Palmer George, who wrote Old Newmarket, was also a member there, and it was quite a group. Now, Mary Folsom had some issues. It seems she was a little bit homicidal. So 5 years before this, she was committed to the state hospital in Concord. And after 3 years, they decided she was cured. Well, every Friday, Mr. Folsom would take the train up from Somersville to the Exeter Depot, and there he would hire a carriage or something to get over to Rockingham. Well, this day, his wife, Mary, met him with a carriage and horse at the Exeter Depot, and he said, "What a nice surprise." And she said, "Yes, I thought we could drive home together." So they did. And on their way back, they came down through on 108, past where the Stewart farm is, and all of a sudden, she pulled a revolver and shot him 5 times in the back of the head, because she was afraid he was going to leave her for another woman. Well, he left her anyway, and people that were motoring came across the scene, and they saw her standing there, him laying there. She had the gun at the hand at the time, blood all over the place. So they kind of hot-footed it to the nearest town and got the sheriff. He went back out, and she confessed and told him, "I threw the gun over the fence." So he went over the fence. Sure enough, there was the gun. 5 shots gone, 1 shot remaining. Went to court. She was convicted of first-degree murder, and she was declared insane and sent to Concord again, where she escaped. She escaped in 1917. 9 years later, come to find out, she had been in Troy, New York the whole time, under the name of Mary Rust and running a bakery. But she decided it was time to fess up for what she did. So she traveled back to Dover, and she went to the lawyer who was the conservator of her property and confessed, and they sent her back to Concord. I don't know why. That was the Folsom Follies. Next, we have blood on the sidewalk. Now, this area is in front of the post office, across from the Big Bean, okay? Corner of Church and Main Street. It used to be a store called Priest Clothing Store. Okay, Priest Clothing Store, there it is. Well, it seems that loom fixer John Crotty and James G.W. Davis had a slight altercation late one night there. Mr. Crotty was coming back from friends in Dover on his way home. James G.W. Davis had spent the day in a muster in Manchester, a fireman's muster. And firemen are known for partying and stuff. Mr. Davis was also known to be rather feisty when he had a few in him. And he took umbrage to loom fixer John Crotty not wanting to talk to him and really pay any attention to him when he was walking past him. So he accosted him and attacked him. John Crotty, in an attempt to save his life, grabbed a rock that was there, hit him in the side of the head, and went home. Well, unfortunately, Mr. Davis died. And the blood was left on the sidewalk for over a week. for the townspeople to gawk at because they were considering it evidence. But Mr. Crotty was acquitted of murder, and it was decided it was self-defense. But, you know, blood on the sidewalk for a whole week. We're going to change up a little bit now because we're going to talk about Henry Tufts. And everybody wants to be related to Henry Tufts. I kind of call him Teflon Hank because nothing stuck to him and he didn't stick to anything else. He was born in Newmarket and he left by the time he was 18. 12, 25, I was born January 24th, 1748, in a house on the Newmarket Plains. My parents were godly people. My father, a Harvard ordained Congregationalist. I never sought trouble. However, trouble seemed to seek me. I can remember walking to school past Mr. Sewell's orchard. I was allowed to take any apples on the ground, but the ones on the trees were better. Mr. Sewell did not like that. My first job was as tithing man at the meeting house of Reverend John Moody. Unfortunately, the glitter of gold and silver was irresistible, and my services were dispensed with forthwith. I decided it was time to leave Newmarket and find my fortunes. I found that I thoroughly enjoyed the company of ladies. So I met and married Abigail. Then Lydia, and finally Sally Judd. At the age of 30, I was caught up with revolutionary fervor. And headed east to fight for the colonies as they paid a handsome bounty. I faithfully fulfilled my first 2 months service and found I needed more funds. So I left my regiment and enlisted again in another state. I found it very difficult to engage in battle. When in upstate New York, in a tavern, I met a nice man who told me how easily you could pass counterfeit specie of the colonies. He gave me several large bundles. I acquired a horse and started south. I had not gone very far when I realized I was a family man and needed to provide for my families. So I sent bundles off to each of my wives. At the conclusion of hostilities, I felt that my dear wife, Sally, deserved a special treat and acquired several silver spoons. It came as a great surprise to find out they were stolen. I found myself languishing in the Ipswich jail on a charge of capital theft. My counsel was Charles Francis Dana, soon to become Chief Justice of the First United States Supreme Court. The first trial was deadlocked. After 3 more trials, I was found guilty and sentenced to hang. I watched as the gallows were constructed. With shouts of stay and galloping hooves, it seems that a petition from my dear wife, Nabby, and some Harvard students asking clemency was successful. And Governor Samuel Adams commuted my sentence to life. Thousands of people had gathered to watch my demise. Under the circumstances, I was not sorry to disappoint them. I spent 5 years in Castle Island in jail, after which I was transported to Salem. The next morning was beautiful, so I escaped. As I headed northwards, I contemplated which of my 3 wives I should seek. After penning eloquent letters of farewell to Sally and Lydia, I headed north to dear Nabby in Leamington, Maine. While in Leamington, I made friends with local natives and was adopted into the tribe after saving the life of the chief's son. Over the course of my life, I have been incarcerated over 20 times in Maine, New Hampshire, New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And now it is a new century and time to clear the slate. Henry Tufts died in January of 1801. He left behind him a 300-page self-serving autobiography, which in 1807 was published by a firm in Dover, New Hampshire, which was known for publishing religious tracts. But Henry still wasn't done causing trouble, because the local inhabitants were so incensed that this printer would publish his autobiography that they broke into and sacked his publishing office. His book is still in print, and it's called The Autobiography of a Criminal. Sweet dreams, everyone. This is just a tip of the iceberg.
Do you plan on doing more of these?
Right now, I'm having a problem with pneumonia in my breathing. Normally, I do a tour called Murder, Mischief, Mishaps and Mayhem, Tales of Old Newmarket. I can't do the walk and the tour and the talk all together at this point in time. But each year, that tour changes, even though it's the same. So I intersperse different stories each year. So, and it's actually much more fun. Okay, it's actually much more fun when you're outside with a lantern and the leaves blowing. I only did one tour at midnight, and I said never again, because the people spent all night in the bar. And do you know what it's like trying to keep 20 people on the sidewalk at 2 o'clock in the morning? Doesn't work. So normally they're like at 7 o'clock at night now. So, but yeah. So, and I also am writing some of them out. John Herman, who's a local author, has pushed me to write down a lot of the things that I've learned in the stories, and hopefully someday they'll be in a book called Ripples from the Lamprey. So, okay, yes.
Whereabouts did the fierce infestation happen? I grew up on the area.
I believe it was around the area of Lubberland Farm, which is the Nature Conservancy, which is why I use the photo of the salt marsh. So, yes.
The house that you call the slaughterhouse
Yes.
on the corner of Nichols Avenue and Elm, when was that torn down?
1932. It was the first building to come down after the strike. Yeah. So before that, it was known as the French Block. not to be confused with Warsaw Street, which was behind it. That's where all the Polish people lived. Yes. He was born in Newmarket on the Newmarket Plains, not exactly sure where. Father was a Congregationalist minister, I believe in Lee, not in Newmarket, because Reverend Moody was in Newmarket at the time. And he was in Newmarket till he was about 18. And Sylvia Getchell hated Henry Tufts. She said he was only here for 18 years. I said, but Sylvia, it's a great story. Everybody loves Henry. Good old Teflon Hank. Newmarket Plains is going out 152 where the sand pits are and all the pine trees. It's very flat. Of course, it's not flat anymore because they dug all the big holes for the sand pits, but it used to be, that was known as the Newmarket Plains. So. Yes. That was the house that they boarded in. And John, do you remember which one it was?
Yes, it's the one right on the corner of Packers Falls. It's the oldest house in the village, 1764.
Royce Carpenter's house for people who, yeah.
Corner of Main Street, South Main Street, in Packers Falls.
The one that just sits face to.
The love nest.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, cool. No, he lived up on the hill too. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, there you go. I asked you if you had Mary Lambert in the family. Now I said I'm going to talk about her. I gave you a heads up. She didn't get any money out of him though, so no. But she did get a trip to Nice. So yeah.
One little comment about the Mr. Carrick who hit his wife with an axe. He was a Civil War veteran who from Ireland. His wife was also from Ireland. They met in the mills. He joined the I forget which regiment now, but from town. His name is on the GAR monument. Although they were banned from Newmarket, they went to Epping. Epping welcomed
Took 'em in.
Took them in. But they may have been banned by the civil government, but they saw redemption, and they're both buried at Calvary.
There we go. Catholics, you always get them in the end. Okay, thank you so much for coming out tonight.